It all started with the party, a simple dinner gathering that Celeste insisted on hosting. She had pitched it as a networking event for her colleagues, and while the idea didn't thrill me, her excitement was enough to sway me. Celeste had a knack for charming people, and I figured this was just one of those moments where I could support her. After all, that's what marriage is about, right? The guest list was long, filled with names that meant little to me, except one. Rylan. When Celeste mentioned him, her voice carried a slight edge, a tone I couldn't quite place. I brushed it off at the time. Maybe it was nothing. On the night of the party, Celeste was stunning. She wore an emerald green dress that hugged her frame perfectly, drawing glances from nearly everyone in the room. I wasn't immune to her beauty either. For a moment, I felt proud, but then my eyes caught something. A flicker of something deeper when she spoke to Rylan. The way her laughter lingered, her gaze softened. It felt different. At first, I told myself I was imagining things. But later, when I stepped into the kitchen to grab more wine, there they were, standing too close, speaking too quietly. It wasn't just casual conversation. The air around them felt charged, like an invisible thread was pulling them together. "Need any help?" I asked, louder than I intended. My voice broke the moment, and Celeste jumped, her face a mix of surprise and guilt. Rylan, on the other hand, didn't flinch. He turned to me with a smirk, that self-assured kind that screamed arrogance. He excused himself, leaving Celeste scrambling to downplay the situation. "You're being ridiculous," she said, brushing off my unease. "He's just a colleague." Her dismissal stung, but I let it go, for the moment. After the party, I couldn't shake the image of them in the kitchen. Celeste carried on as if nothing had happened, her usual bubbly self, but to me, something felt off. It wasn't just her words or her actions. It was the subtle way she avoided my eyes when I tried to talk about Rylan. "Do you need help cleaning up?" I asked that night as she gathered wine glasses from the living room. She shook her head, barely looking up. "It's fine, I'll handle it," she said. "You've done enough." Enough? That word stuck with me. I wasn't sure why, but it felt loaded, like there was something unsaid hanging between us. I pushed the thought aside, hoping it was just my own paranoia playing tricks on me. But over the next few weeks, the cracks began to show. Celeste started staying late at work more often, her reasons vague. "Big project deadlines," she'd say, though when I asked for details, her answers were clipped, rushed. One evening, her phone buzzed on the counter while she was in the shower. The screen lit up with a message. "Rylan D." My stomach sank. The preview read, "Last night was amazing. When can I see you again?" I stared at the phone, my heart pounding. The words blurred in front of me as the reality of what I was seeing set in. Last night. She'd said she was working late at the office. My hands trembled as I put the phone back down. I didn't want to jump to conclusions, but how could I not? When Celeste came out of the bathroom, towel wrapped around her, I confronted her. "Who's Rylan?" I asked, my voice calm but strained. She froze for a second, just a second, but it was long enough to confirm my suspicions. "He's a colleague," she said, recovering quickly. Her tone was sharp, defensive. "Why are you snooping through my phone?" "I wasn't snooping," I shot back. His message popped up. "And it doesn't sound like work." Her face hardened. "You're being insecure." This is why I didn't want to say anything, because I knew you'd blow it out of proportion. I wanted to believe her. God, I wanted to believe her. But her anger felt forced, her indignation rehearsed. The way she turned the blame on me made me feel like I was the problem. It only made the knot in my stomach tighten. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, replaying every interaction between her and Rylan in my mind. The way she laughed at his jokes, the way she touched his arm ever so slightly, it all added up, like pieces of a puzzle I didn't want to solve. The following days were a haze of suspicion and doubt. I wanted to give Celeste the benefit of the doubt, but that message from Rylan kept replaying in my head. I found myself scrutinizing her every move, every word. Was she really working late, or was there more to the story? Then, one Friday evening, she told me she had another late meeting. "It's the campaign I mentioned," she said while slipping on her heels. "I might not be back until after midnight." I nodded, keeping my face neutral. "Do you need me to wait up?" No, she said quickly. Too quickly. Don't worry about me. After she left, I felt a mix of anger and helplessness. I couldn't keep sitting in the dark, wondering. I needed answers. So, I did something I never thought I'd do. I decided to follow her. Earlier in the week, I discreetly installed a GPS tracker on her car. It felt like a betrayal of my own principles, but at that point, I was desperate for the truth. Watching the blinking on my phone, I saw her car leave the city center and head toward the outskirts. My pulse quickened. This wasn't the route to her office. The tracker stopped at a small, nondescript house on a quiet street. I parked a block away and approached cautiously. The blinds were partially open, and the light from inside cast faint shadows on the curtains. Peeking through a gap, I saw her. She was there, laughing, her hand on Ryland's shoulder. He leaned in, whispering something, and she touched his face, an intimate gesture that made my stomach churn. I clenched my fists, forcing myself to stay calm. Storming in wouldn't solve anything, not now. Instead, I pulled out my phone and started snapping pictures. Evidence. Proof. I wasn't going to let her gaslight me again. When I got back to my car, my hands were shaking so badly I could barely unlock the door. My mind raced with what I'd just witnessed. I didn't drive straight home. Instead, I sat in the car for what felt like hours, staring at the photos on my phone. It was undeniable now. That night, when Celeste finally came home, I pretended to be asleep. I couldn't face her, not yet. Not until I figured out my next move. The morning after I followed Celeste, I woke up to the sound of her humming in the kitchen. She was making coffee like everything was normal, like she hadn't just come home hours earlier smelling faintly of cologne that wasn't mine. I lay there for a moment, staring at the ceiling, torn between anger and heartbreak. Eventually, I pulled myself out of bed and joined her. She smiled when I walked in, her face the perfect mask of innocence. "Morning," she chirped, handing me a mug. "You seemed tired last night. Everything okay?" I studied her carefully, trying to gauge if there was even a flicker of guilt in her expression. But she was good, too good. "Yeah," I replied flatly. "Long day." She turned back to the stove, flipping eggs with practiced ease. Watching her like that, it struck me how effortlessly she could live two lives. How she could stand there making me breakfast while carrying on with someone else. It made me question every moment we'd shared. Was it all a lie, or just the parts involving him? I spent the rest of the day trying to act normal, which was harder than I thought. Every time she spoke, I felt myself analyzing her words, searching for cracks in the facade. And then there was her phone. It sat on the counter, buzzing every so often. Each time, she glanced at the screen and tilted it slightly away, a subtle move, but one I couldn't ignore. That evening, while she was showering, I finally gave in. I picked up her phone, my heart pounding in my chest. I knew her passcode. It was our wedding anniversary, which suddenly felt like a cruel joke. Swiping through her messages, I found what I feared. More texts from Rylan. "Last night was incredible. I can't stop thinking about you." My grip on the phone tightened as I scrolled further. There were photos too. Nothing explicit, but the way they posed together, their faces close, her smile brighter than I'd seen it in months. It was enough to make my blood boil. When she came out of the bathroom, towel wrapped around her, steam trailing behind her, I was sitting on the edge of the bed with her phone in hand. She froze, her eyes darting to the screen before meeting mine. For a moment, we just stared at each other, the silence heavy between us. "Do you want to explain this?" I asked, my voice deceptively calm as I held up the phone. Her expression shifted, flickering between shock, anger, and finally defiance. "You went through my phone," she snapped, snatching it from my hand. "That's such a violation of privacy." I laughed bitterly, standing up. "Privacy? You're worried about privacy? What about honesty, Celeste? What about loyalty?" She crossed her arms, her jaw set stubbornly. "You're blowing this out of proportion. Rylan is just a friend." "A friend?" I scoffed, stepping closer. "Friends don't send messages like this. Friends don't spend the night together at some random house while their husbands are at home wondering where they are." Her eyes narrowed. "You're being paranoid. Nothing happened." "Don't lie to me," I said, my voice rising. "I saw you. I followed you, Celeste. I know. Her face paled, and for the first time, she looked genuinely rattled. But instead of apologizing, she doubled down. You had no right to do that, she hissed. This is why I can't talk to you anymore, because you're always accusing me of something. I shook my head, a bitter laugh escaping my lips. You're unbelievable. You betray me, and somehow I'm the bad guy? Do you even hear yourself? She didn't answer. Instead, she stormed out of the room, slamming the door behind her. I stood there for a long time, staring at the empty space she'd left. In that moment, I realized the woman I thought I knew was gone, replaced by someone I could barely recognize. The days following that confrontation were a blur of tension and unspoken words. Celeste acted like nothing had happened, moving through the house with an air of forced normalcy. She cooked dinner, asked about my day, even laughed at a joke I made during a rerun of a sitcom we used to watch together. But it was all surface level, like a play she was rehearsing, trying to convince me, and maybe herself, that things were still fine. I, on the other hand, was drowning under the weight of what I'd uncovered. My mind kept replaying the image of her and Rylan together, the messages on her phone, her blatant lies when I confronted her. It was like a constant hum in the background, growing louder every time she smiled at me or kissed my cheek goodbye before heading to work. One evening, as she sat on the couch scrolling through her phone, I decided I couldn't keep living in limbo. I had to know the full extent of her betrayal. Without a word, I walked into the kitchen and retrieved the GPS tracking logs from the app on my phone. My suspicions were confirmed when I saw her car had made another trip to that same house just 2 days prior. The rage I'd been suppressing bubbled to the surface. I walked back into the living room, holding my phone up as if it were a piece of evidence in a courtroom. Care to explain why you were back at Rylan's house? I asked, my voice steady but cold. Celeste looked up, startled. For a moment, she didn't speak, her eyes darting to the phone in my hand. Then she sighed, setting her own phone down. I don't know what you're talking about. Don't, I snapped, stepping closer. Don't insult me with another lie, Celeste. I have the GPS logs. I know exactly where you've been. Her face tightened, her composure cracking ever so slightly. He needed my help, she said finally, her tone defensive. It was work-related. I didn't think you'd understand. Work-related. I repeated, laughing bitterly. Do you take me for an idiot? Work doesn't involve sneaking off to someone's house at night, texting them about how incredible they are, and lying to your husband. Her eyes flashed with anger. You've been tracking me? That's insane. Do you even hear yourself? You're acting like a jealous lunatic. I took a deep breath, trying to keep my temper in check. I'm not the one sneaking around, Celeste. I'm not the one lying to my spouse. You can call me crazy all you want, but I'm not the one who destroyed this marriage. For a moment, I thought she might apologize, might finally admit the truth. But instead she stood up, her expression icy. You've already made up your mind, haven't you? No matter what I say, you're going to think the worst of me. Because you've given me nothing else to believe, I shot back. I loved you, Celeste. I trusted you. And you threw it all away for what? Him. She didn't respond. Instead, she walked past me, grabbing her purse from the table. I'm not doing this with you, she said over her shoulder. Not tonight. The door slammed behind her, leaving me alone in the silence. I stood there for a long time, my fists clenched, my chest heaving. That was the moment I knew things had gone too far. She wasn't going to stop, wasn't going to come clean. And if she thought I was going to sit back and let her turn my life into a mockery, she was sorely mistaken. That night, I made a decision. If Celeste wanted to play games, I'd play too, but by my rules. It was time to gather everything I needed to take control of the situation. She had broken our vows, and now it was my turn to make her face the consequences. The next morning, Celeste wasn't home. I wasn't surprised. She had a pattern now. Sneak out during a fight, come back hours later with some flimsy excuse about needing space or time to think. I didn't bother texting or calling her. Instead, I got to work. First, I compiled everything I had, the photos I'd taken outside Rylan's house, the GPS logs, and screenshots of their messages I'd forwarded to my own email before she snatched her phone away. It wasn't hard to build a solid case. The evidence painted a damning picture, one even she couldn't argue with. I also hired a private investigator to dig deeper. If there was more to their relationship, more places they'd gone, more lies she'd told, I wanted to know. It wasn't just about catching her. I wanted every piece of ammunition for the inevitable fallout. By the time Celeste came home late that evening, I had an entire file ready. She breezed through the door with the same air of nonchalance she'd perfected, tossing her purse on the counter and greeting me with a casual hey. It was almost laughable how normal she tried to act. "Busy day?" I asked, barely looking up from my laptop. "Exhausting," she replied, kicking off her heels. "I'm going to take a shower." I watched her disappear down the hallway, the sound of water running soon filling the house. It gave me time to steel myself. Tonight wasn't the night to confront her, not yet. I needed to wait until I had everything. The next few days passed with the same cold routine. Celeste's movements were predictable at this point. Work, late nights, a strained smile when she was home. Meanwhile, the PI I'd hired delivered exactly what I'd suspected. More meetings with Rylan, hotel stays, and a handful of dinners where she looked happier than I'd seen her in months. There was no denying it now. She wasn't just stepping out on me, she was building a second life, one that didn't include me. One evening, I caught her in the middle of texting. She was sitting on the couch, her legs curled under her, a faint smile playing on her lips. It wasn't hard to guess who she was talking to. "Who's keeping you so entertained?" I asked, leaning against the doorframe. She startled, locking her phone and setting it face down on the cushion beside her. "Just a work thing," she said quickly. Too quickly. I nodded slowly, my expression neutral. Work must be fascinating these days. Her jaw tightened, and for a moment, I thought she might say something. But she just stood, muttering something about being tired before heading to the bedroom. The next morning, I called my lawyer. I explained the situation in detail, laying out everything I had. "I want to proceed," I said firmly. "I need to protect myself." He didn't waste time. By the end of the week, the divorce papers were ready. I didn't plan to serve them just yet, not until I could deliver them in a way Celeste would never forget. Over the weekend, I put the rest of my plan in motion. First, I sent anonymous emails to her closest friends, attaching a few choice photos of her and Rylan. My wording was careful, concerned, not accusatory. "I thought you should know what's been going on," I wrote. Then I turned my attention to Rylan. The PI's report included his workplace, so I drafted an email to his HR department, attaching the same photos along with a polite note about inappropriate relationships and potential conflicts of interest. From what I'd gathered, his company had strict policies about workplace conduct. If he thought he could waltz into my life and take what was mine without consequences, he was in for a rude awakening. By Sunday night, I felt more in control than I had in weeks. Celeste had no idea what was coming, and for the first time in a long time, I slept soundly. By Monday morning, the dominoes were already starting to fall. Celeste had left early for work, giving me the house to myself. I spent the quiet hours preparing, rehearsing in my head how the next few days would play out. At noon, I got a text from a mutual friend, Claire. It was vague but loaded. "Hey, is everything okay between you and Celeste? I've been hearing some things." I smirked. The emails had done their job. Whispers were spreading among her social circle, and the truth was beginning to surface. I didn't respond right away. Let them stew on it for now. Later that afternoon, I got an update from the PI. Rylan had been summoned to a meeting with his HR department. It seemed my email had stirred up some trouble at his job. The thought of him squirming in his office, trying to explain away the photos, brought a grim satisfaction. One piece of the puzzle was sliding into place. When Celeste came home that evening, her demeanor was different. She looked frazzled, her usual calm exterior cracking at the edges. "Rough day?" I asked, keeping my tone casual. She hesitated, then nodded. "Yeah, just work drama. Anything you want to talk about?" I pressed, watching her closely. "No," she said quickly, brushing past me toward the kitchen. Her evasiveness was telling. She knew something was brewing, even if she didn't know the full extent yet. The next day brought even more fallout. Rylan's HR department had decided to take swift action, placing him on administrative leave pending further investigation. According to the PI, he'd been seen leaving the office midday, his face a mask of anger and frustration. I imagined his charm was wearing thin in a workplace suddenly cautious of scandal. That evening, I made my move. Celeste had planned dinner with her parents, a routine event we usually both attended. This time, I let her go alone, claiming I had a work commitment. Instead, I showed up halfway through the meal, walking into the restaurant just as they were about to order dessert. Her face froze when she saw me. "Andrew, what are you doing here?" she asked, her voice a mix of surprise and unease. I ignored her, greeting her parents warmly instead. "I thought this would be the perfect time to talk," I said, sliding a manila envelope across the table toward Celeste. "What is this?" she asked, her hands trembling slightly as she opened it. Inside were the divorce papers, along with a neatly printed packet of evidence. The photos, the messages, the GPS logs. Her mother gasped, her face paling as she glanced at the documents. "Celeste, what is this?" she demanded. Celeste's composure shattered. "Andrew, you didn't—" "I did," I interrupted coldly. "You made your choices, Celeste. Now you have to live with them." Her father, a man who'd always respected me, shook his head in disappointment. "Celeste, how could you?" he muttered, his voice low but filled with anger. The table fell into an awkward silence, broken only by the faint clink of silverware from nearby diners. I stood, smoothing my jacket. "I'll leave you to explain, Celeste. I think your parents deserve to hear the truth." As I walked out of the restaurant, I felt a strange mix of emotions, relief, vindication, and a lingering ache I couldn't quite shake. She had betrayed me, but part of me still mourned the life we had built together, the future I'd once envisioned. When I got home that night, her things were gone. A hastily scribbled note sat on the counter. "I'll stay with a friend for now. We need to talk soon." I crumpled it up and tossed it in the trash without reading the rest. The house felt quieter after Celeste left, the kind of silence that wasn't peaceful. It was heavy, like the air had turned thicker in her absence. I sat in the living room, staring at the empty space where her favorite chair used to be. She must have taken it when she left. The sight of the bare carpet only fueled the mix of emotions churning inside me. The next day, I focused on the next phase of my plan, Rylan. Taking him down wasn't just about revenge anymore, it was about making a statement. You don't get to walk into someone else's life, tear it apart, and walk away unscathed. The PI had dug up plenty on him, but the most useful information came in the form of his routine. Rylan was a creature of habit. Every Friday night, he went to the same bar downtown. It was one of those upscale places where overpriced cocktails and self-important conversations flowed freely. I decided it was the perfect setting. That evening, I parked a block away, making sure my car wouldn't show up on any nearby security cameras. I didn't want this traced back to me. Inside, the bar was dimly lit, filled with people who looked like they belonged in a glossy magazine spread. Rylan was easy to spot, leaning against the bar with his trademark smug expression, a glass of something amber-colored in hand. I waited until he stepped outside for a smoke. It was almost too easy. The alley was narrow, tucked between two buildings, with no cameras in sight. I stepped into the shadows, gripping the tactical baton I'd brought. "Rylan," I called, my voice calm but firm. He turned, squinting to make out my face in the dim light. "Andrew," he said, his confusion quickly giving way to a smirk. "What are you doing here? Finally realized you can't keep her?" The arrogance in his tone ignited something in me. I didn't say a word. I just moved. The baton struck his midsection with a satisfying thud, doubling him over. He gasped, clutching his stomach, his bravado crumbling instantly. "Next time," I said, leaning in close, "think twice before you mess with another man's life." I snapped a quick photo of him crumpled on the ground, his face twisted in pain, and sent it to Celeste. My message was simple. This is what your excitement looks like. When I got back to my car, adrenaline still coursing through my veins, I half expected guilt to creep in. But it didn't. Instead, there was a strange sense of clarity, as if I'd finally taken back a piece of myself that had been stolen. By the time I got home, Celeste had responded to my message. "What the hell is wrong with you?" she wrote. Her words didn't sting like they used to. I simply deleted the text and blocked her number. She'd lost the right to have any say in my life. The next day, I woke up to more fallout. Word had spread about Ryland's altercation. He was no longer just on leave, he was terminated. His company didn't want the liability, and whatever charm he'd relied on to get by wasn't enough to save him. As for Celeste, the whispers among her friends had turned into full-blown accusations. From what I heard, she was becoming an outcast in the social circles she once dominated. It was ironic, really. The perfect life she'd tried to build outside of ours was crumbling before her eyes. For the first time in weeks, I felt a sense of calm. The chaos that had consumed my life was finally giving way to something steadier. I wasn't fully healed, but I was beginning to see a path forward, a life without her lies, without the weight of betrayal dragging me down. The days following my encounter with Ryland were surprisingly quiet. For the first time in what felt like months, I wasn't consumed by anger or suspicion. Instead, there was a sense of finality, a closure that came from knowing I'd taken back some control over my life. But as the adrenaline faded, reality began to sink in. The life I'd built with Celeste, the plans, the dreams, the future we'd envisioned together, was gone. The silence in the house was both a relief and a reminder. I spent my evenings in the living room, sipping whiskey and staring at the walls, now devoid of the framed photos she'd taken with her. Her absence left a void, but I'd be lying if I said I missed her. What I missed was the version of her I thought I knew, the woman I'd loved and trusted, the woman who never really existed. One evening, as I was sorting through old papers in the study, I found a stack of handwritten letters tied with a ribbon. They were from our early years of dating, back when she'd write me notes filled with dreams about our future. I untied the ribbon and read a few, her words dripping with affection and promises of forever. The irony of it all wasn't lost on me. Those words had been a foundation for the life we'd built, a foundation she'd shattered without hesitation. I considered burning the letters right then and there, but something stopped me. Instead, I tucked them away in a drawer, not out of sentimentality but as a reminder, a warning to myself about the dangers of blind trust. That weekend, I received a call from one of Celeste's friends, Claire. We hadn't spoken directly since the emails I'd sent out had set her social circle ablaze. "Andrew," she began, her tone cautious. "I wanted to check in. I heard things have been rough." I almost laughed at her understatement. "You could say that." She hesitated before continuing. "Look, I don't want to pry, but Celeste, she's not handling this well. She's saying you ruined her life. I thought you should know." For a moment, I didn't respond. Her words didn't spark the reaction she probably expected. Instead of guilt or regret, I felt a strange sense of satisfaction. Celeste had chosen her path, and now she was facing the consequences. "She ruined her own life," I said finally. "All I did was shine a light on the truth." Claire was quiet for a moment. "You're not wrong," she admitted. "I just thought you should hear it." After the call, I found myself wondering about Celeste's current state. She'd always been someone who thrived on appearances, on being admired and envied. Losing that must have been unbearable for her. But as much as I wanted to know more, I couldn't bring myself to reach out. She wasn't my responsibility anymore. The next week, the divorce proceedings began in earnest. My lawyer, a sharp and unflinchingly pragmatic man named Ross, had already warned me that Celeste would likely fight for every penny. "People like her," he'd said during our initial meeting, "they don't like to lose. Be prepared for a battle." And a battle it was. Celeste's lawyer came at me with accusations designed to paint me as controlling and vindictive. They brought up the GPS tracker, the confrontation at the restaurant, even the emails I'd sent to her friends. But Ross was ready. He countered with the evidence I'd gathered, the text messages, the photos, the private investigator's report. By the time he was done, it was clear who had betrayed whom. In the end, the settlement was fair, if not entirely satisfying. She got the car and a portion of our savings, but I kept the house and, more importantly, my dignity. The day I signed the final papers, I felt a weight lift off my shoulders. It was over. I was free. As I left the courthouse, I stood on the steps for a moment, letting the reality of it sink in. I wasn't the same man who'd walked into that dinner party months ago, clueless about the storm brewing right under his nose. That man had been naive, trusting to a fault. The man I was now was harder, sharper, more guarded. And while part of me mourned the loss of that innocence, Another part knew it was necessary. That night, I met up with an old friend, Jake, at a local bar. He'd been one of the few people who stuck by me through everything, offering support without judgment. As we clinked our glasses together, he grinned. "To new beginnings," he said, raising his drink. "To new beginnings," I echoed, the words heavy with meaning. For the first time in a long while, I felt a spark of hope. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, but it was mine to walk, and that was worth everything. The weeks after the divorce felt like stepping into a new life. Not an easier one, but a life that was finally mine. I packed up the last of Celeste's things, what she hadn't already taken in her hurried departure, and left them in a box by the front door. She sent someone to collect them a few days later. No note. No goodbye. Just silence. The same silence she'd left me with for months before everything fell apart. At first, I didn't know what to do with all the time and space I suddenly had. The house, once filled with her laughter and the clatter of wine glasses during her frequent networking events, now seemed cavernous. But slowly, I began to reclaim it. I started by repainting the walls in colors I liked. She'd always insisted on muted tones, classy neutrals, she called them, but I chose something warmer, livelier. It felt symbolic, like I was erasing her influence one brushstroke at a time. Then I tackled the backyard, which had been her pet project but never quite lived up to her vision. Over a few weekends, I turned it into something simple but satisfying. A fire pit surrounded by sturdy Adirondack chairs, a small garden with easy-to-manage plants. It wasn't extravagant, but it was mine, and that made it perfect. Through all of this, I kept to myself. Friends reached out, offering support, invitations to dinners, and drinks, but I wasn't ready for all that. Jake was the exception. He didn't push, didn't try to fix me. He'd just show up with a six-pack and a story about his chaotic workday, sitting with me in the backyard as the sun dipped below the horizon. It was a small comfort, but it meant more than I could say. One evening, as we sat by the fire pit, Jake leaned back in his chair, nursing his drink. "So," he said, his tone casual but probing, "what's next for you?" "Next?" I echoed, staring into the flames. "Yeah. You can't just sit here forever, man. What do you want? A fresh start? A new city? Or maybe just a new chapter here?" I hadn't thought about it much, but his words stuck with me. What did I want? The idea of leaving everything behind, this house, the memories, even the city, was tempting. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized I didn't want to run. This was my life now, and it was up to me to shape it into something worth living. The next morning, I made a list. Not a grand, sweeping bucket list, but small, manageable goals. Reconnect with old friends, pick up a hobby, join a gym. I started with the gym. It was awkward at first, being surrounded by strangers who seemed to know exactly what they were doing while I fumbled with the equipment, but I stuck with it. Over time, it became a routine, something that grounded me. Then there were the friends. I called up a few people I hadn't spoken to in years, apologizing for my absence and explaining, in vague terms, what I'd been through. Most of them were understanding, some even enthusiastic about rekindling our connection. It was refreshing, realizing that the world hadn't ended just because one relationship had. And then there was the unexpected. At the gym, of all places, I met someone. Her name was Sophie. She wasn't flashy or larger-than-life like Celeste had been. She was down-to-earth, with a sharp wit and a smile that felt genuine in a way I hadn't seen in years. We started as workout partners, chatting between sets, but it quickly became more. Sophie wasn't a replacement for Celeste. She was a reminder that not all connections have to be complicated or laced with betrayal. She was kind and direct, and for the first time in a long time, I felt like I could breathe around someone. One evening, as we walked through the park near my house, she turned to me. "You seem lighter," she said, her brow furrowing thoughtfully. "Lighter?" "Yeah. Like you're finally letting go of something heavy." I smiled, looking up at the sky where the first stars were beginning to appear. "Maybe I am." That night, after Sophie left, I sat in my backyard, staring at the fire pit I'd built with my own hands. The house was quiet, but it didn't feel empty anymore. It felt like mine. For the first time in months, I wasn't haunted by the past or anxious about the future. I was here in this moment, and that was enough. People say revenge doesn't heal, and maybe they're right. But as I sat there, feeling the cool night air on my face, I realized healing wasn't the goal. Reclaiming myself was. And I'd done that. Here's to new beginnings.